The question revolves around the interpretation of National Electrical Code, or NEC, Section 210.52 concerning receptacle placement in a room with built-in bench seating. The core issue is whether the bench seating should be considered a wall space, thus requiring electrical outlets according to the code. The inspector is citing NEC Section 210.52, which mandates that receptacles be installed in all wall spaces that are more than 2 feet long. The inspector's argument is that the bench seating, even though it incorporates storage accessible from above, constitutes a wall space and therefore necessitates outlets. On the other hand, there's an argument that the bench seating should not be treated as a wall space due to its permanent nature and the potential hazard that outlets placed behind the seating could pose. The concern is that outlets in this location would be impractical and potentially create a tripping hazard. The NEC doesn't explicitly define the term wall space. However, the inspector's perspective, viewing the bench seating as a wall space, holds some validity because it presents a vertical surface exceeding 2 feet in length. Conversely, the argument highlighting the potential hazards and impracticality of placing outlets in that location also carries weight. The NEC does allow for exceptions to the general rule requiring outlets in wall spaces, particularly when safety concerns arise or when the installation would be impractical. In this specific scenario, one could argue that placing outlets behind the bench seating introduces a hazard due to their proximity to the floor and their vulnerability to being bumped or tripped over. Furthermore, accessing these outlets, especially when someone is seated on the bench, would be difficult. Considering these arguments, the inspector's interpretation of the code is technically sound. However, it's crucial to evaluate the safety and practicality aspects of installing outlets in this particular situation. A constructive approach involves discussing these concerns with the inspector and seeking a compromise that addresses both the code requirement and the safety and practicality needs of the installation. One possible solution could be to install outlets on the sides of the bench seating. This placement would improve accessibility and reduce potential hazards. To delve deeper into the requirements of NEC Section 210.52, it states that in every kitchen, family room, dining room, living room, parlor, library, den, sunroom, bedroom, recreation room, or similar room or area of dwelling units, receptacle outlets shall be installed in accordance with the general provisions specified in 210.52 through refer. Wall space is a critical concept here. In dwelling units, a wall space includes any space 2 feet or more in width, unbroken along the floor line by doorways, fireplaces, and similar openings. Effectively, this means any continuous section of wall that's at least 2 feet wide requires a receptacle outlet. This helps ensure that occupants can easily plug in lamps, appliances, and other devices without having to run extension cords across doorways or other openings. Receptacle spacing plays a role. Receptacles must be installed so that no point measured horizontally along the floor line of any wall space is more than 6 feet from a receptacle outlet. This generally translates to receptacles being placed no more than 12 feet apart along a wall. The intent is to provide convenient access to power wherever it's needed in a room. Wall space occupied by fixed cabinets isn't considered wall space. For example, kitchen cabinets that are permanently installed aren't considered when determining receptacle placement. However, if there's a section of wall above the cabinets that's at least 2 feet wide, it would still need a receptacle. Floor receptacles can be used to meet the requirements of 210.52. However, they must be located close to the wall. This is especially useful in large rooms where furniture placement might block access to wall receptacles. The goal is to ensure that there's always a readily accessible outlet nearby. NEC Section 210.52 addresses countertops and work surfaces. In kitchen and dining areas, receptacles are required along countertops and work surfaces that are 12 inches or wider. This is to accommodate small appliances like toasters, blenders, and coffee makers that are commonly used in these areas. The NEC provides specific guidelines for installing receptacles on countertops, including spacing requirements and placement relative to sinks and cooking appliances. NEC Section 210.52 pertains to bathroom receptacles. At least one receptacle outlet must be installed in bathrooms within dwelling units. This receptacle must be located within 3 feet of the outside edge of each basin. The receptacle is intended for use with hair dryers, electric shavers, and other grooming appliances. In most jurisdictions, bathroom receptacles must be ground fault circuit interrupter or GFCI protected to reduce the risk of electric shock in wet environments. NEC section 210.52 covers outdoor receptacles. For dwelling units, at least one receptacle outlet must be accessible from the outside of the dwelling. This receptacle is intended for use with power tools, holiday lighting, and other outdoor equipment. Like bathroom receptacles, outdoor receptacles typically require GFCI protection. Additionally, they must have a weatherproof cover to protect them from the elements. The specific rules about what constitutes wall space, the spacing of receptacles, and exceptions for things like fixed cabinets are all aimed at making sure that electrical outlets are conveniently located and safely installed in residential buildings. It's important to consult the latest edition of the NEC and local amendments to ensure compliance with all applicable requirements. Now, addressing the specific case of the bench seating, it's important to consider several factors. Firstly, the definition of wall space needs careful interpretation. While the NEC doesn't provide an exact definition, the general understanding is that a wall space is a continuous section of wall that's 2 feet or more in width and unbroken along the floor line. In this case, the bench seating creates a vertical surface that's more than 2 feet long, which could be interpreted as a wall space. Secondly, the permanence of the bench seating is a relevant factor. If the bench seating is permanently affixed to the structure of the room, it could be argued that it's similar to fixed cabinets, which are typically not considered wall space. However, the fact that the seat part of the bench lifts up for storage might weaken this argument, as it could be seen as more of a furniture item than a permanent part of the building's structure. Thirdly, the safety and accessibility of outlets placed behind the bench seating are major concerns. Outlets in this location would be close to the floor and potentially obstructed by the bench itself, making them difficult to access and increasing the risk of tripping or accidental damage. The NEC does allow for exceptions to the receptacle placement rules when safety or accessibility are compromised. Therefore, it's reasonable to argue that installing outlets behind a bench seating would not be practical or safe. Given these considerations, the best approach is to discuss the situation with the local electrical inspector and try to reach a compromise that meets both the code requirements and the practical needs of the homeowner. Here are a few possible solutions to consider. 1. Install outlets on the sides of the bench seating. This would provide convenient access to power while avoiding the safety and accessibility issues associated with placing outlets behind the bench. 2. Install floor receptacles in front of the bench seating. This could be an option if wall receptacles are not feasible, but it's important to ensure that the floor receptacles are located close to the wall and are protected from physical damage. 3. Obtain a formal interpretation from the local electrical authority. If there's still uncertainty about whether the bench seating should be considered wall space, it may be helpful to request a formal interpretation from the local electrical authority. This would provide a definitive answer and help ensure compliance with the code. In summary, the question of whether bench seating should be considered wall space under NEC section 210.52 is a complex one that depends on the specific circumstances and the interpretation of the local electrical inspector. By carefully considering the definition of wall space, the permanence of the bench seating, and the safety and accessibility of outlets, it's possible to reach a solution that meets both the code requirements and the practical needs of the homeowner. Consulting with the local electrical inspector is always the best way to ensure compliance and avoid potential issues. Some additional points to consider when discussing this issue with the electrical inspector include the following. Firstly, provide documentation. Gather any relevant documentation, such as photos of the bench seating, diagrams of the room layout, and copies of the NEC code sections in question. This will help the inspector understand the situation and make an informed decision. Secondly, explain your reasoning. Clearly explain why you believe that installing outlets behind the bench seating would be impractical or unsafe. Be prepared to provide specific examples and explain how the proposed alternative solutions would address the code requirements while also ensuring safety and accessibility. Thirdly, be open to compromise. The goal is to find a solution that meets both the code requirements and the practical needs of the homeowner. Be willing to consider alternative solutions that the inspector may suggest and be prepared to make concessions if necessary. Fourthly, obtain a written agreement. Once you've reached an agreement with the inspector, get it in writing. This will help avoid any misunderstandings or disputes in the future. It's also a good idea to keep a copy of the written agreement with your electrical permit and inspection records. By following these steps, you can increase your chances of resolving the issue successfully and ensuring that your electrical installation is safe and compliant with the NEC. Remember that electrical codes are in place to protect people and property from electrical hazards. While it's important to understand the code requirements and advocate for practical solutions, it's also essential to prioritize safety and ensure that all electrical work is performed by qualified professionals. If you're not comfortable performing electrical work yourself, it's always best to hire a licensed electrician to do the job. They will have the knowledge and experience to ensure that the work is done safely and in compliance with all applicable codes and regulations. In addition to the specific code requirements discussed above, there are also some general safety considerations to keep in mind when installing electrical outlets. Firstly, use the correct type of outlet. Make sure you're using the correct type of outlet for the intended application. For example, use a GFCI outlet in bathrooms, kitchens, and other wet locations. Secondly, follow the manufacturer's instructions. Always follow the manufacturer's instructions when installing electrical outlets. This will help ensure that the outlets are installed correctly and safely. Thirdly, test the outlets. After installing electrical outlets, test them to make sure they're working properly. You can use a simple circuit tester to check for proper wiring and grounding. Fourthly, protect the outlets. Protect electrical outlets from physical damage and moisture. Use weatherproof covers for outdoor outlets and tamper-resistant outlets in homes with young children. By following these safety precautions, you can help prevent electrical shocks, fires, and other hazards. Remember that electricity can be dangerous, so it's important to take safety seriously and always follow best practices when working with electrical systems. It is also beneficial to understand the penalties for non-compliance. Failure to comply with the NEC can result in a variety of penalties depending on the jurisdiction and the severity of the violation. These penalties can include fines, legal action, and even criminal charges in some cases. In addition to the legal penalties, non-compliance can also result in increased insurance rates, difficulty selling or renting the property, and potential liability for damages or injuries caused by electrical hazards. Therefore, it's always best to ensure that your electrical installations are compliant with the NEC and all other applicable codes and regulations. The process of obtaining electrical permits and inspections can vary depending on the jurisdiction, but it typically involves the following steps. Firstly, apply for a permit. Before starting any electrical work, you'll need to apply for an electrical permit from your local building department. The permit application will typically require information about the scope of the work, the location of the project, and the name and license number of the electrician performing the work. Secondly, submit plans. In some cases, you may also need to submit detailed plans of your electrical installation to the building department for review. The plans should show the location of all electrical outlets, circuits, and equipment, as well as the wiring methods and materials to be used. Thirdly, schedule an inspection. Once the electrical work is complete, you'll need to schedule an inspection with the building department. The inspector will come to your property and inspect the electrical installation to ensure that it complies with the NEC and all other applicable codes and regulations. Fourthly, correct any deficiencies. If the inspector finds any deficiencies during the inspection, you'll need to correct them and schedule a re-inspection. This may involve making repairs, replacing equipment, or rewiring certain areas. Fifthly, obtain approval. Once the electrical installation has passed inspection, you'll receive a certificate of approval from the building department. This certificate is proof that the electrical work has been completed in accordance with all applicable codes and regulations. It's important to keep a copy of the certificate with your property records. By following these steps, you can ensure that your electrical work is properly permitted and inspected, which will help protect your safety and prevent potential legal issues. Consulting with qualified electricians and electrical contractors is also an important step. Electrical work should always be performed by qualified professionals who are licensed and insured. Licensed electricians have the knowledge and experience to ensure that electrical work is done safely and in compliance with all applicable codes and regulations. When hiring an electrician, be sure to check their credentials, ask for references, and get a written estimate before starting the work. It's also a good idea to ask the electrician about their experience with similar projects and their knowledge of the NEC. By taking these steps, you can help ensure that you're hiring a qualified professional who will do the job right. A brief note on the history of the NEC is also worth noting. The National Electrical Code has been developed and maintained by the National Fire Protection Association, or NFPA, since 1897. The NEC is a comprehensive set of standards for the safe installation of electrical wiring and equipment in the United States. It's updated every 3 years to reflect changes in technology and best practices. The NEC is not a law itself, but it's widely adopted by state and local governments as a basis for their electrical codes. The NEC covers a wide range of topics, including wiring methods, overcurrent protection, grounding, and equipment installation. It's an essential resource for electricians, electrical inspectors, and anyone else involved in the design, installation, or maintenance of electrical systems. Understanding the NEC is critical for ensuring electrical safety and compliance with applicable codes and regulations.